being blighted by bad landlords and tenants. Well, here's another story about housing, this time affecting people who bought their homes. Now, it concerns fees for the upkeep of the estates they live on. Now, Helen Goodman believes property developers are exploiting the rules around so-called freehold charges to make extra profit. And she wants to see a change in the law. And we'll hear from her in a moment. But first, David McMillan can explain what it's all about.
A house is the most expensive thing we'll ever buy, and we expect to keep shelling out for years on mortgage payments, insurance and renovations. But many people living on new builds have an extra cost to bear: estate maintenance. That's charges for things like grass cutting or the upkeep of streetlights and playgrounds. It can be an expensive business, and on this estate near Bishop Auckland, property owners like David Hope don't feel they're getting value for money.
This area of grass is the only part of the estate that's actually managed by the management company. Now, collectively 35 households are obliged to pay this management company the sum of £5,737 a year. That was this year's bill for the cutting of the grass. We know that the actual cost of the grass cutting amounts to £600.
Campaigners estimate that some 1.3 million people are affected across the country. David says there's no easy means of overturning the charges.
When we receive these charges, you just can't dispute them. There's no way of entering into any discussion with this company as to why the charges appear to be so excessive. You're basically obliged to pay the fees, otherwise you're threatened with court action, bailiffs, etc.
Estate fees are paid in areas where the council hasn't adopted the developed land. Andrew Whittaker from the Home Builders Federation says that residents should direct their anger at the local authorities, not at the developers.
The bill that comes through from the management company has to be borne by someone. We have to pass that cost on to the residents. If the local authority had adopted the space, then that maintenance would come out of their council tax. These people with a grievance are attacking the wrong people.
But Cathy Priestley from the Homeowners' Rights Network says many estates are built so poorly, local authorities just can't take on the risk.
Your liability for the estate is potentially enormous. The majority of people in our group would like is for estates to be adopted and built up to adoption standards.
These concerns have led to calls in Parliament for a change in the law to help protect homeowners in the region.
David McMillan reporting. Helen Goodman, why do you think this is so important that you've actually actively tried to seek to change the law on it?
It's a real rip-off, and people are paying hundreds of pounds, and the fees are escalating. People are getting the fees increased 50% a year, and if you look across the country as a whole, a small number of agents who own these bits of land, they're raking in maybe 100, maybe 200 million pounds a year. It's just a scam, and it's wrong.
Well, obviously, those agents say that they are being as transparent as they can, etc. They're not here to defend themselves and, are spending this money. But aren't you blaming the wrong people here? Isn't it the councils that should take responsibility for this?
Well, if the developers made the roads and the open spaces up to a proper standard, then the councils could adopt them. But what they do is they first of all save money by making the roads really rickety without enough tarmac on, for example, and then they sell them on to their friends in the agencies, who then charge the people again in order to keep them up. So it's a double whammy, really.
And the councils don't want to take them on because it suits them, doesn't it, as well, to avoid having to pay for these areas?
So for the future, I think it would be completely reasonable for the councils to give planning permission only in the cases where there was a promise to bring them up to adoptable standard within a reasonable timescale. But we've got lots and lots of people, as you saw, who haven't got into that situation. Yeah.
Okay. Judith Wallace, this is a terrible burden for many people who feel badly misled when they bought these homes. Who's to blame, councils or housing developers?
I think the housing developers, but I think also that solicitors and conveyancers really ought to explain very clearly to their clients what they're actually buying. Clearly these poor residents don't realise what they have taken on at the time, and that ought to be very clear to them that this is a huge liability.
Well, I think sometimes these housing developers get them to use their own
Well,
housing
in which
developers,
case,
solicitors.
yeah,
but,
well,
yeah.
very, very badly advised to do that. You really need an independent person. So I think you need to have clearly explained, and as purchasers, people really need to read very carefully. I do have some sympathy with Helen's plan here. It seems astonishing that there is no recourse. Leaseholders, for example, I think can go to an ombudsman, and I would have thought that to have something very similar would be appropriate to address this problem. Councils won't adopt these places where they are not built up to the proper standard. There are some estates where part of it is intended to be adopted, other parts aren't. That's a huge liability for those residents. But the purchasers must have it explained to them clearly what it is that they're taking on, so that they have a choice to say, well, we don't like the sound of that, we'll not buy that house in the first place.
Helen Goodman, your bill comes back to the Commons in January. You know the bills introduced in this way very rarely get into legislation. Have you any chance?
Well, the next thing I'm going to do is organise a debate where the Minister has to respond, because the first one, I made a speech and that's it, that's how the process works. So I'm going to organise a new debate in the new year where the Minister has to answer, because they're putting through legislation all the time. They could tack my idea into their bill. That, I think, is realistic.
Have you got cross-party support? Because this must be happening in lots of areas.
As a matter of fact, I had to have 10 sponsors, and I got Tories to be among those 10 as well.
Judith Watt, shouldn't the government back Helen's bill?
Yes, I would have thought that that was a sensible thing to do. And at the very least, it is raising awareness so that would-be purchasers are hopefully more alert to what they might be landing themselves with if they buy a property with this sort of liability.
Realistically, the government's going to be, whatever the government is by that stage, pretty distracted, isn't it, Helen Goodman? You're not optimistic?
Yeah, that is one of the problems with Brexit. It uses up so much energy when there are lots of other things we'd all like to be tackling.
OK, Helen Goodman and Judith Wallace, thank you very much for discussing that. I'm sure we'll talk about that